You ever wonder how much a $50 padlock is actually worth when the world starts to burn around you? Or how a woman in a pink bathrobe, holding a glass of Chardonnay, can suddenly turn into a gatekeeper of life and death? I used to think my biggest problem in Harmony Creek was the occasional gopher in the garden, or the way the dust kicked up when a mail truck drove too fast, but that was before Eleanor Vance decided that her vision of aesthetic consistency was more important than the fire safety of our entire valley. My name's Alex, and I'm just a guy who likes his peace, his scruffy terrier buddy, and the satisfaction of a well-built fence. But apparently, in the eyes of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, I was a radical insurgent harboring a visual eyesore that needed to be neutralized. It was a Monday, the kind of morning where the air is so crisp it feels like a fresh apple, and I was out by the edge of my property near the old gravel easement, just checking the hinges on my wooden access gate. Now, this isn't just some random gate. It sits right over a federally designated emergency water main, a massive high-pressure valve that feeds the hydrants for the whole ridge. And as someone who helped design the local grid back in 2017, I knew exactly why that path had to stay clear. But Eleanor Vance, a woman who treats the HOA charter like it's the third tablet brought down from Mount Sinai, didn't care about water pressure or emergency response plans. She only cared that my rustic, weathered cedar gate didn't match the modern farmhouse vibe she was trying to force on the neighborhood. I saw her marching down the road, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield, wearing those oversized sunglasses that make her look like an angry insect, and I knew. I just knew. It was going to be a long day. She didn't even say hello. She just stopped at the gate, clicked her tongue in that rhythmic, annoying way she does, and pulled a shiny silver padlock out of her designer tote bag. I stood there, hammer in hand, watching her loop a heavy chain through the slats and snap that lock shut with a smug little click that echoed through the trees. And for a second, I honestly thought it was a prank. "Eleanor," I said, walking over while trying to keep my voice from hitting that octave of pure frustration, "did you really just lock my private access gate to my own property?" She turned slow, real slow, looking at me over the rim of those glasses with a smile that was about as warm as a January frost in Alaska. "Alex, dear, we've discussed this in the board meetings you never attend. Ordinance 14B is quite clear about visual consistency for all structures visible from the community hiking trail. And this rustic monstrosity is a blight on our collective property values." I tried to explain. I tried to be the rational adult, telling her that the gate was there for the fire department, that the valve 10 feet behind it was the only thing standing between us and a dry hydrant if the ridge caught fire. But she just waved a dismissive hand, the kind of gesture you use to shoo away a fly. The HOA has its own security protocols, Alex, and an unsecured gate is an invitation to vagrants. So if you want it unlocked, you can petition the board at the next quarterly review, provided you've stained the wood to the approved desert sand hue. And then, because Eleanor Vance doesn't just do things halfway, she didn't just lock the gate and leave. Oh no, she unfolded a flimsy little lawn chair right there on the grass, cracked open a bottle of kombucha, and sat down like she was the sentry at Buckingham Palace. She spent the next 4 hours sitting there, glare-checking the Amazon driver and making notes on her clipboard every time Buddy barked at a squirrel, acting like she was protecting the sanctity of the suburbs from the horror of unapproved cedar. I retreated to my porch, heart thumping a jagged rhythm in my chest, looking at the eastern horizon where the sky was starting to take on a hazy, bruised purple color that I knew all too well. The heat that afternoon was oppressive, the kind of dry, sucking heat that turns the pine needles into tinder and makes the air feel like it's being sucked out of your lungs. And by 4 p.m., the smell of smoke wasn't just a suggestion anymore. It was a warning. I checked the fire maps on my phone, watching the crimson bloom of a wildfire jumping the eastern ridge, moving toward Harmony Creek at a speed that felt predatory. I looked down at the road, and Eleanor was still there, sitting in her chair, oblivious to the fact that the wind was shifting, oblivious to the fact that the safety she was so obsessed with was about to be tested by something that didn't give a damn about her desert sand color palette. By the time the sun started to sink, it wasn't a sunset, it was a hell's cape. The sky was a pulsing, angry orange, and the haze had turned into a thick, choking fog of ash that coated the leaves like gray snow. I ran down to the gate, yelling at her to move, telling her the fire was coming and the crews would need that valve, but she just tightened her robe. She'd actually gone inside and changed into a fluffy pink bathrobe at some point, and told me to stop being dramatic and that emergency services have their own keys to official gates. She didn't understand that this wasn't an official HOA gate. It was a private easement that the fire department relied on for speed, and that $50 lock was now a barricade against the only thing that could save us. Then came the sirens, a low, mournful wail at first, then a screaming, mechanical roar as two heavy brush trucks and an engine came thundering down the access road, their red and blue lights strobing against the smoke like a fever dream. They skidded to a halt in front of the gate, the fire chief, a man I've known for a decade, jumping out before the truck even stopped moving, his face a mask of soot-streaked urgency. He ran for the gate, saw the chain, saw the lock, and then he saw Eleanor sitting there with her wine glass, looking at him like he was an uninvited guest at a garden party. "Unlock this gate now," he roared, but Eleanor, in her infinite, bathrobe-clad wisdom, just stood up and started talking about unauthorized passage and HOA jurisdiction, while 4 miles away, a wall of flame was eating its way toward the Thompson family's ranch. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, watching the firefighter struggle with a pair of small bolt cutters that couldn't bite into the hardened steel of the lock, and I realized that common sense had officially left the building, and if I didn't act, the whole neighborhood was going up in smoke. The roar of the fire was no longer a distant threat. It was a living, breathing beast, a sound like 1,000 freight trains barreling toward our valley, and the heat was becoming a physical shove against my chest. I looked at the fire chief, a man who had stared down hell itself more times than I could count, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated desperation in his eyes. He was looking at that gate, then at Eleanor, then back at his trucks, while the embers began to fall around us like glowing orange snow, landing on Eleanor's pristine white lawn chair and burning tiny black holes into the fabric. And Eleanor? She was still standing there, clutching her wine glass with a white-knuckled grip, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch as she screamed about legal warrants and HOA board approval, while the very air we were breathing began to shimmer with the distortion of extreme heat. "I don't have time for this insanity," the chief bellowed, but his men were already retreating to the trucks, their small bolt cutters having snapped against the hardened steel of that $50 lock. They were talking about rerouting, about a 17-mile detour around the mountain to reach the secondary main, but I knew with a sickening certainty, that by the time they got there, the Thompson place would be nothing but a memory and a pile of ash. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue with her anymore. I just turned on my heel and sprinted back toward my shed, my boots kicking up clouds of gray ash that tasted like burnt pine and old regrets. I jumped into my heavy-duty 4x4, the engine roaring to life with a mechanical snarl that seemed to challenge the wind, and I backed it up with a violence that sent gravel spraying against the side of the house. I grabbed the heavy tow chain from the bed, the iron cold and heavy in my hands, and I looped it around the trailer hitch before jumping back into the cab. I floored it toward the gate, the headlights cutting through the swirling smoke to find Eleanor standing right in my path, her arms crossed, her pink bathrobe fluttering in the gale-force winds of the approaching fire. "Alex, you stop this instant. This is destruction of property," she shrieked, but I didn't even slow down. I skidded to a stop inches from her toes, leaped out, and wrapped that chain through the gate slats and around the padlock hasp with a speed born of pure adrenaline. I didn't look at her. I didn't listen to her threats about lawyers or liens. I jumped back in the driver's seat, slammed it into 4 low, and screamed, "Get back," as I hammered the accelerator. The tires spun, screaming for traction on the loose gravel, the smell of burning rubber mixing with the acrid stench of the fire. And then, crack! It wasn't just the lock. The entire wooden post, the hasp, and the chain ripped free in a shower of splinters and tortured metal. The gate swung open violently, slamming against the fence, and before the dust had even settled, the fire engines were surging through the gap, their massive tires churning the ground as they raced toward the valve hatch. For the next 4 hours, I worked alongside the crews, the world reduced to the blinding glare of floodlights and the deafening hiss of high-pressure water as it hit the advancing flames. We were a line of ghosts in the smoke, fighting for every inch of dirt, while the valve, the one Eleanor thought was an eyesore, poured thousands of gallons of life-saving water into the thirsty hoses. But even with the valve open, even with the heroics of the crew, the news came through the radio like a gut punch. The Thompson house was gone. The delay, those 10 or 15 minutes spent arguing over a padlock, had been the difference between a saved home and a total loss. When the sun finally rose on Tuesday morning, it revealed a valley that looked like a monochrome nightmare. Black trees, gray ash, and the skeleton of the Thompson ranch smoldering in the distance. I was sitting on my porch, covered in soot, my lungs burning with every breath, when the silence was broken by the sound of a luxury SUV door slamming shut. It was Eleanor. She had the audacity to walk up my driveway, her white pantsuit spotless, her clipboard already back in her hand. And she didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask about the Thompson family. She handed me a formal notice of vandalism. "The board has met, Alex," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and wounded pride. "You've caused $1,500 in damage to HOA-managed security infrastructure, and you've created an unsafe precedent for community emergency response. You'll be hearing from our legal team by the end of the week." I looked at her, then at the burnt remains of the valley, and I realized then that you can't reason with a person who thinks a rulebook is more important than a human soul. The next few days were a blur of cold anger and strategic planning. I went to the diner, and the silence that met me wasn't one of judgment, it was one of solidarity. The whole town knew what had happened. Maggie at the cafe told me Eleanor had already filed a police report for destruction of property, but the sheriff had laughed in her face and told her she was lucky he didn't arrest her for obstructing emergency personnel. Still, the HOA wasn't backing down. They were doubling the fines, threatening a lien on my house, and calling for an emergency conduct review. That's when I called Mark. Mark is a guy who reads municipal contracts for breakfast and has a specific, burning hatred for overreaching HOAs. We sat in his office, surrounded by the smell of old paper and stale coffee, and I showed him the files I'd kept since 2017. Mark's eyes lit up as he scrolled through the GIS maps and the FEMA grant documents. "Alex," he whispered, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "She didn't just lock a gate. She obstructed a federally funded, Homeland Security-designated critical infrastructure easement during a declared state of emergency. This isn't an HOA dispute anymore. This is a federal felony." We didn't just wait for the hearing. We went on the offensive. Mark pulled the original easement agreement from 1997, a document Eleanor had clearly never read, which explicitly stated that the unobstructed access to Gate E17 is perpetual and shall not be impeded by any private association or local ordinance. Then, he found the smoking gun, an anonymous tip from a disgruntled board member who had BCC'd us on a private email thread. In it, Eleanor had explicitly written, "I know the county says it's an emergency path, but if we don't enforce the lock now, we'll never get him to stay in the wood. Use the safety hazard excuse, it always works." She had admitted to premeditated obstruction for the sake of a paint job. Armed with that, we walked into the town hall meeting on Wednesday night. The room was packed, the air heavy with the resentment of a community that had almost burned to the ground. Eleanor sat at the front, her allies Jenkins and Doyle by her side, looking like they were ready to pronounce judgment on a criminal. She started her spiel about community standards and unauthorized vandalism, but I didn't let her finish. I stood up, unrolled the 2017 federal infrastructure blueprints across the council table, and let the room go dead silent. "Eleanor," I said, my voice echoing in the hall, "you want to talk about standards? Let's talk about the federal standard for interfering with Homeland Security assets during a disaster. Because while you were worried about the color of my gate, the Thompson family was watching their lives turn to ash. And I've got the email that proves you knew exactly what you were doing." The silence in that hall was the loudest thing I've ever heard. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, where the ground is still, but you can feel the mountain shifting. Eleanor's face went from a defiant, practiced mask of authority to a shade of pale that I can only describe as bureaucratic terror. Her hand hovered over her clipboard, but she didn't write a word. Beside her, Jenkins and Doyle, the two board members who had been her loyal foot soldiers, suddenly started leaning as far away from her as their chairs would allow. Looking at the ceiling, looking at their shoes, looking anywhere, but at the manila folder Mark was sliding across the council table. Mayor Thompson, whose cousin was the one who had lost everything in that fire, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the email where Eleanor had admitted to using a safety hazard excuse to force a paint job. He didn't shout. He didn't bang his gavel. He just looked at Eleanor and asked, in a voice as cold as a mountain stream, "Mrs. Vance, did you or did you not receive the 2018 county notification regarding the federal designation of Gate E17? Eleanor tried to find her voice. She tried to talk about procedural confusion and conflicting mandates, but the mayor just held up the signed acknowledgement form from 2018, with her own signature at the bottom. That was the moment the dam finally broke. The room erupted in a way I've never seen in our sleepy little town. People were standing up, calling for her resignation, demanding to know why their safety had been traded for a visual consistency review. I saw Denise Miller, the quietest woman in town, shouting with tears in her eyes about how she'd had to pack her kids into the car, not knowing if they'd have a home to come back to, and all because of a $50 padlock. It wasn't just a meeting anymore, it was a reckoning. The fallout was swifter than anything the HOA's bylaws could have ever predicted. By Friday morning, Eleanor hadn't just been removed from the board, she had been effectively exiled. The state fire marshal's office didn't play around. They referred the case to the Attorney General, and within 48 hours, the Harmony Creek HOA was hit with a state-level injunction that froze their ability to levy any fines or liens until a full forensic audit of their enforcement practices was completed. I watched from my porch as a sheriff's deputy, the same one who had laughed at her police report, walked up to her pristine white door and handed her a summons for a grand jury investigation into reckless endangerment and obstruction of critical infrastructure. But the real victory wasn't in the courtrooms or the legal papers. It was in the way the air felt on Saturday, a week after the fire. We had a community work day at the Thompsons' lot. Over 50 neighbors showed up with shovels, chainsaws, and trailers to help clear the charred remains of their dream, so they could start over. Even Martin, the guy who used to rubber stamp whatever Eleanor wanted, was there, sweat pouring down his face as he hauled away burnt timber. He didn't say much, but he gave me a nod that felt like an apology. The HOA eventually settled. They didn't have a choice. They paid for my truck repairs. They paid into a rebuilding fund for the Thompsons, and they officially signed over a permanent emergency deed of access that ensures no one, not even a future board of clipboard-wielding Karens, can ever put a lock on that gate again. We even installed a new gate. It's still the same rustic cedar, not desert sand, thank you very much, but now it has a solar-powered smart lock that's hardwired into the county's dispatch system. If the fire department needs in, they just hit a button on their dash, and the path opens wide. I still have that $50 padlock, the one I ripped off with my truck. It sits on my workbench in the shed as a paperweight, a twisted, scarred hunk of metal that serves as a reminder of how dangerous a little bit of power can be when it's held by someone with a small mind. Eleanor sold her house a month later. I saw the moving trucks from my porch. She didn't wave goodbye. She didn't look at the ridge. She just climbed in her SUV and drove out of Harmony Creek for the last time, probably looking for another neighborhood where the grass is exactly 3 inches tall and the residents don't know their own rights. As I sit here now, Buddy snoring at my feet and the sound of the evening breeze rustling through the pines that didn't burn, I realize that we got lucky. It could have been so much worse. It could have been a tragedy we never recovered from. But it taught us something. It taught us that a neighborhood isn't built on visual consistency or aesthetic harmony. It's built on the trust that when things get dark, we'll stand together to keep the lights on and the water flowing. So, I've got to ask you, have you ever felt like your HOA or your local board was more interested in the look of your life than the actual living of it? What do you think the line is between a community standard and a public danger? I've seen enough of these clipboard kings to know they don't stop until someone pushes back. So tell me your stories in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for common sense in a world of red tape? Let's get a discussion going. And if you think people like Eleanor need a serious reality check, hit that like button and share this with someone who's tired of the HOA drama. Because at the end of the day, A gate should be there to protect us, not to hold us hostage while the world burns.